Hello viewers, welcome to week 6, lecture 4 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory, part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. And in this lecture, I will continue to talk about Roland Barthes' concepts about literary criticism. In this lecture, we are going to talk about particularly two things: Barthes' distinction of pleasure and bliss in context of the act of reading, and various kinds of codes, 5 codes that he conceptualizes, which help in understanding literature, particularly a short story of Balzac that he has analyzed in that context. So, before we try to understand Barthes' concept of pleasure and joussa, that is pleasure and ecstasy or bliss, a sort of joussa can be translated as a sort of organic bliss that a reader feels, orgasmic bliss that a reader feels in the act of reading. Before we understand these concepts, we need to know that these concepts are somehow culmination of the previous concepts that he has discussed in context of the structure of a literary text. For instance, he has talked about writing as transitive as well as intransitive verb. And as we have seen that how Barthes has idealized writing as an intransitive verb. Writing something that is not about something, but writing itself. Not a writer writes something, that is not the case. That is condition of transitive verb, while the condition of intransitive verb is simply a writer writes. Similarly, he also talks about two kinds of text: readerly text and writerly text. And we find that how in all these discussions, Barthes is very much like Greimas. He is also emphasizing the presence of reader and this act of reading, which makes sense of a structure that a literary artifact is. So, he has already distinguished between readerly text and writerly text. Readerly text is one in which the reader is in a passive condition. He is a consumer of that given work of art, and somehow he acquiesces without questioning in the worldview that has been represented in a text that is called readerly text. But against the readerly text, Barthes pits the writerly text. And he says that writerly text is superior in the sense that the reader is no more left as a reader in act of reading, rather he becomes a co-author. So the involvement of reader actively is something that is the nature of writerly text. So writerly text is something that is very different from readerly text. And he says that often you will find that texts which are considered to be classics, they are, more or less readerly. Writerly texts are those which are unique, which are extraordinary in terms of use of organization of language and establishing relationship between different elements of language. However, having said that, he says that this experience of reading a writerly text is very different from the experience of reading a readerly text. In what way it is different? So, in his work, The Pleasure of the Text, which was published in 1975, Barthes, distinguishes between pleasure and joussa. So, pleasure may be taken as a simply, as we understand the word pleasure, we derive pleasure out of that activity. And jusa is something, a bliss. It may be taken as the highest kind of pleasure. He uses other terms such as ecstasy. Ecstasy is something that is different from pleasure. In that way, pleasure can be something in which, superficial level of involvement of the reader may be there, or a superficial kind of experience. While so far as this ecstasy is concerned, it has a deeper experience, and it can be compared with what he calls sexual orgasmic delight. So in that sense, it could also be a moment of epiphany. It could be also a moment of revelation in a text, right? So in context of those words, we can try to understand what he says. So he says that so far as this pleasure is concerned, it comes from the very comfortable consumption of a readerly text, right? In which the sensibility of the reader is not provoked beyond a certain point. So it is simply consumption of a text in a passive way, in a comfortable way, and in a way, pleasure a reader derives from readerly text is tantamounts to a kind of status quo. Suppose a text has certain values, certain conventions. The reader believes that the reader has to acquiesce in those conventions and traditional values or ethical values as they have been, or even reality that has been represented in the text. So passively he has to accept it. He has to yield to that. And in yielding to that, and in a way, he takes all those things as normative, as those things are given there. Something, they have attained the aura of something that is natural, normal. So in this way, yielding to normal and this realization of normal is something that gives a reader pleasure. But so far as this moment called jusa is concerned, this experience of ecstasy is concerned, it comes out of moments of disruption, where reading is not a simple activity. It is not like a vehicle going on an highway without any disturbance. It is like, reading experience can be taken as a vehicle, and then suddenly there is some disruption. Suddenly there is a sudden application of brake. Suddenly you are startled. You are surprised, flabbergasted by something in the text. And that is how that ecstasy is created. So their reading is not a simple act. It is an adventurous act. And in this way, he says that their language exposes a space of erotic and liberating possibility. He goes on to define that how it can be understood in context of eroticism. And in that way, he, gives the examples of wearing dresses. So he says that if somebody is wearing dress, so what causes eroticism? So this nakedness of body, this gapping in dress, so which is erotic? He calls it intermittence. So he says the intermittence of skin flashing between two articles of clothing, where the garment gapes, and in this way, where the garment. So in this way, a text can be taken in that similar. So he says that the highest literary experience occurs when meaning itself is suspended in the act of reading, and it becomes an ecstatic and co-creative event. Further, he goes on to say that, pleasure lies in the overt linguistic ordering imposed by the readerly text on its material. So he says that this readerly text and writerly text, many times it depends on the conventions of reading, right? The same text may be, because of its reading experience, it may be, so in a way they are somehow related to each other. He says that that when this linguistic ordering is imposed on the material of the text, that is the readerly text, and the experience that the reader has in that case is that of pleasure. So far as bliss is concerned, he says that it comes out of a writerly text. Text, and he says that uh, at climactic movements in readerly ones, when the order breaks down, when the garment gapes, when overt linguistic purpose is suddenly subverted and so orgasmically transcended. He goes on to say that text of pleasure, the text that contents, fills, grants euphoria, the text that comes from culture and does not break with it, is linked to a comfortable practice of reading. Text of bliss, the text that imposes a state of loss, the text that discomforts, perhaps to the point of a certain boredom, unsettles the reader's historical, cultural, psychological assumptions, the consistency of his tastes, values, memories, brings to a crisis his relationship with language. So we understand that this jusa or that ecstasy, it is realized, or a bliss is realized in the act of reading when reading is not a smooth process, and we find that the text is disrupting or breaking the what is called the normative or so-called natural. Having said that, Barthes moves on to analysis of Balzac's famous story, Sarrasine, and there we find that how he says that any kind of fiction, any kind of prose narrative, it cannot be understood on the basis of the content that the story or that linguistic construct is trying to make. It simply cannot be understood in the sense that it reflects the reality outside in a remarkable way. Rather, he develops certain codes, certain conventions of reading, and he finds certain very common features which he describes as various kinds of codes. For example, hermeneutic or symbolic or proaretic or semic code. So how all these codes, they help in understanding that how a literary text itself becomes a signifying system, right? So here Barth's goal is to show that the text is not a transparent window onto reality, but rather totally signifying a complex system of meanings. And what he does in Balzac's story, Sarrasine, he breaks it into 561 lexias or units of reading and analyzes those lexias through different or distinctive codes. So let us, talk about various kinds of codes that Barth is talking about. So, for example, this hermeneutic code. He looks at hermeneutic code as something that raises a question. And in this way, he looks at a plot not simply as an arrangement of events in a particular order, or not as Russian formalists have believed that, how plot is seen as an aesthetic structure which reshuffles various elements of story. Rather, Barths look at a text or at a plot as something which can be understood in terms of raising certain questions and certain answers. Now, they are not always necessarily certain direct questions to be answered. Many times they are raised in different tones, right? So, plot is not something which is concerned with the story or events in the life of a person or life of a character. Rather, it is a very different kind of meaning. in which he tries to understand the lang of the construction of plot. So all plots can be understood in terms of these things that he is saying. For example, hermeneutic code, in which a query is there. Maybe sometimes that query is also a problem which has to be resolved in the plot. So as we conventionally understand that in plot there is a beginning, there is the middle, there is the end, then there is this rising action, then there is this denouement or climactic moment, and then in the end, all these things are given a different or a different terminology. For example, he says that this code organizes the text's mysteries and questions. It may create various suspenses in the text, and various enigmas may be there which are to be answered and which are to be satiated in the text. So in this way, he says that this hermeneutic code, it consists of all the units whose function is to articulate in various ways a question, its response, and the variety of chance events which can either formulate the question or delay its answer, or even constitute an enigma and lead to its solution. And this is really the storytelling code, by means of which the narrative raises questions, creates suspense and mystery before resolving these as it proceeds along its course. So he talks about the title of Balzac's story. He says it offers a good example of hermeneutic code. It forces us to ask, who is this Saracen? What is this Saracen? And what it is about? So that single word, that is something which, arouses the curiosity of the reader. And in this way, the way title has been conceived, it is representative of that hermeneutic code. So in this way, he goes on to say that unfortunately, however, the mystery of the Lentis presented a continuing source of curiosity, which shows the coding of a mystery to which the reader naturally wants a solution, and which the story obviously promises him. So this code usually involves syntactic ordering, vocabulary, and can be recognized by its general shape, a process of mystifying together with the implicit promise of subsequent demystification, the generation of suspense to be followed by a sort of disclosure. The second code that he talks about is the code of seams, or what he calls signifiers. He says this is a code of connotations which utilizes hints or flickers of meaning generated by certain signifiers. For example, if we look at the title of the story, Saracen, the final E of the name suggests femininity in this code, a quality much at the center of story's later complications, by a simple lexical hint or flicker. Lexia 4. For instance, midnight had just sounded from the clock of the Elysee Bourbon. Manifest in this code an encoded flicker concerning ill-gotten wealth. For as Barthes says, a neighborhood of Nova riches, the Faubourg Saint-Honor refers to the synecdoche to the Paris of the Bourbon Restoration, a mythic place of sudden fortunes whose origins are suspect, where gold is produced without an origin, diabolically. So in this way, here we find that how this code tells us about various people who become rich, or how there are certain things, for example, the clock or the other symbols which have been used, they represent the generation of wealth in that particular area. So that is how that code works. Similarly, Barthes also talks about the symbolic code. This symbolic code can be understood through patterns of antithesis and symbolic structures such as daydream or male female oppositions. And in this way, the story builds deeper layers of meaning. These configurations are repeated and intensify the text's core symbolic tensions, ultimately emphasizing sexual and social contradiction. Then there is this pro-ieretic code, and Barth calls this pro-ieretic code is something that is showing actions in the story. So various kinds of actions are there, various motives of actions are there, and all those motives of actions and their relationship to the story, to the other events, they can be understood in context of pro-ieretic codes. So he says that concerned with the logic of action and sequence, this code maps the causal structure of events. It means when we look at various actions which are taking place in that plot, they can be understood in terms of cause and effect. So, for example, I was deep in one of those daydreams, suggest an impending disruption. So, Barth notes, however, that these action sequences are more empirical than rational, essentially a reading effect rather than intrinsic structure. Then Barth also talks about the cultural code. Here Barth identifies the gnomic voice, cultural commonplaces that the text assumes the reader shares. Phrases like one of those daydreams call upon accepted knowledge to authenticate the text. Although Barth admits that all codes are cultural, this code specifically highlights the text appeal to shared societal assumptions. So these cultural codes are known to the writer as well as reader. And because they are known to both of them, therefore there is a justification of those codes. So here we find that Barth is saying that how in any text these kinds of codings may be used, and these kind of codings, they are capable of transforming a readerly text into a writerly text. So in this way, you know, when a readerly text is converted into a writerly text, it is freed from many of its traditional conventions or critical constraints, and in this way interpretations of these texts may be multiple, and it is a liberating kind of effect. So he says that his technique shows that even Balzac, the master realist, offers not a direct view of reality, but a minefield of concealed shaping devices, a corridor of distorting mirrors, and a stained glass window or text that signifies heavily without offering pure transparency. So here we find that how, you know, this was the argument with which Barth started, you know, his discussion, that, you know, no writer can be considered innocent, or he is not simply representing the reality that is given there. Rather, in a very complex way, he is developing certain structures, intrinsic laws, you know, which conform to his existence in a particularly given environment, though in a rather impersonal way. So at a deeper level, Barth's analysis undermines the modern belief in unitary authorship and individual meaning. The notion of a unique sovereign author, like the modern ideal of individualized human subject, is historically specific, emerging from Protestantism and capitalism. And this is something that Barth questions here. He says that in medieval times, authorship was collective. Stories were communal rather than personal expression. Barth's broader political critique targets the bourgeois society that naturalizes the link between signifier and signified, stabilizing meaning to sustain its own authority. And here we find that how this very endeavor is, you know, based on Saussure's very basic principle of arbitrariness that exists between, or that relates a signifier with a signified. He says that educational institutions by canonizing text and interpretations, serve this normalizing functions. And his text S/Z works against this by showing that texts are not neutral mirrors of reality, but socially constructed fields of science that can be dismantled and refigured. So, Barth celebrates the freedom of signifiers over signifieds, fixed signifieds, an ideal he locates in Japanese culture, and links to Western form of jusa like jazz, where given materials are endlessly combined, recombined into new creative realities. For example, if we, the other very simple way of understanding Barth's process as a structuralist, what he does. So, first of all, he takes up that reality, he decomposes that reality, and then he recomposes it. He takes up the matter, he decomposes it, and then he recomposes it. That is the endeavor of a structuralist. How a structuralist looks at a given structure, he annihilates it, he demolishes it, and then he restructures it. So, in this way, like jazz musician improvising from existing chords, Barth sees the critic's role as generating new meanings of inherited text, and ultimately S/Z is revolutionary in that way. So, Barth, very much like Remas, concludes, we live not among pure facts, but among endless system of science, a world of science about rather than what we experience of. So there are other concepts of Barth as post-structuralists. So I'm not going to discuss those concepts here. Later on, when we will be doing post-structuralism and deconstruction, in wake of those units, we will talk about two more concepts of Barth, the death of author and from work to text, which demonstrate his typical post-structuralist stand. So with this, I bring this lecture to its end. Thank you.